Welcome back. I'm glad that you could rejoin me so we can take a look at foundation paper piecing, a little bit about some of the background of where it came from. You would be surprised. It's pretty old. It's been around for quite some time. And we'll progress to how incredible things have gotten in using foundation paper piecing and how Legit Kits uses that in order to create these beautiful pieces of art that we'll be working on. So we're going to do that, and then when we finish that, I'm going to talk about some of the tools that I have found very helpful in order to do foundation paper piecing and have it come out as quick and efficient as possible, and make it so that it's a product that I like and enjoy and can see myself creating some beautiful things. So with that, let's talk about where foundation paper piecing came from. This is a piece of paper cut out into a square, a size that is just whatever my granny chose. And my granny used a foundation paper piece back a long time ago. So this is a J.C. Penney catalog she used. But a lot of people use catalogs. They use, some do strips instead of squares, and they'll use like the tape that goes in a calculator. Sometimes they'll use phone books, things like that. Now, a lot of these things are not around anymore. So could you use just regular copier paper and cut it to the size you want? Absolutely. Anything you want to use. When it's something that's a little thinner, it allows you to tear it a little easier, but we'll talk about ways to tear things when it's on copier paper and it might be a little bit thicker. So what my granny would do when she would foundation paper piece is she would take her fabric and she would either diagonally or across one of these vertical or horizontal directions, she would lay her first piece of fabric face up. And then she would take another piece of fabric and she would put it face down on that and sew it and then press it open. She'd go to the other side, sew across there and press it open. And she didn't pay attention to whether or not they were cut precisely. What she would do is she would end up with all this extra off on the edges, right? And so she, as long as she had covered all of the paper, she was fine. Because then she could flip this over and she could take a look at it and see where her paper is. She can now trim that to the exact size right around that, either with a pair of scissors or a rotary cutter. When she finished with this process, what she would have are blocks that look something like this. Now this one she did on the diagonal, so she began with this center piece. She simply sewed this piece on, opened that up, and pressed it. And she took this piece, sewed it on, and opened it up and pressed it. So this was foundation paper piecing. She didn't have lines to sew on, but she basically did the same thing. She put down one piece of fabric to get started with and then layered other pieces on top of that where she wanted them and sewed and pressed it open. Now this still has the paper on the back. She left these to me and I'm going to be making a quilt out of them. But when I'm finished, what I'll do is I will tear this paper off in the same way that we will tear paper off of our foundation paper piecing pieces. Now, she didn't use a smaller stitch like we're going to use, so it's a little harder to tear, but it still comes right off of there. And you can see that this is some of the early stages of foundation paper piecing. Now, that progressed, and these are from the Sew Emma line of foundation paper piecing papers, and they tend to be created for historical, traditional quilt blocks. This is a pineapple block. And so you would just make lots and lots of these. In this case, it's now progressed to the point where we're going to have numbered pieces. So we know what's the first piece we use, the second piece we use, the third piece, the fourth piece, the fifth piece, and so on until we've completed the block. But it's the same process. We place the first piece of fabric face up on the paper, and then we put another piece of paper with right sides facing, or another piece of fabric with right sides facing on the paper, and then that goes underneath the paper and underneath where the lines are, and then we'll sew on the line. After we sew on the line, we'll open those two pieces up and press it out towards that piece. That was the one we just added. And then we'll go to third one, and we'll do the same thing. And so it's the same process, but this creates a standard traditional, very precisely pieced quilt block. And it is a stage of where foundation paper piecing progressed to, with some of the techniques we use today, but still a very traditional block. Okay, so we have the traditional block and we have the historical version with no lines, but now we have things progressed to a point where we can create beautiful pieces of artwork, and we can do that with our fabric. And when we do that, we have pieces like Legit Kits provides us. So this is from a different Legit Kit that I'm working on, not your Starry Night, but it gives us a good example. So in this case, we still have papers that have the number 1, 2, and 3, and lines to sew on. They provide a seam allowance so that we know that that's included. We don't have to worry about adding it. And we can take the color of the fabric, we take it just like we would on the other, and we place it right side up underneath it. Now, if you use a Legit kit, or you get your own fabric and it's all solids like it is in the kit, then you don't have to worry about right side up and upside down, because both pieces of the fabric are the same. So we would put that underneath here, and then we would take this piece, number 2, fold it what would be right sides together, and then place it on there and sew on that seam. Then we would open it up and press it. Exactly like my granny did. We just have different size pieces that are not as uniform, and we have some lines to sew on she didn't have, because they're not all just a straight line across the block. And you can see that by having very different shapes and combinations in the way that we would do this, we are going to create some very unique blocks. It's not going to be like a repetition of a traditional paper piece, a traditional block that's been paper pieced instead of the traditional piecing. It's going to be very unique in each block. And these segments will all go together to create a block. The blocks will go together to create the quilt. So that is very common, that we put smaller pieces together to create a larger piece, and that those blocks then go into our entire quilt. What's different is the size and shape of these. Without the paper, it would be very difficult for us to accomplish this with the precision needed to create the beautiful quilt that's going to result. So this gives us a sense of foundation paper piecing, and you'll begin to see that in full force as we get into our cutting and sewing. And you'll begin to appreciate the fact that we have these papers and these guides in order to create the beauty that's going to come from this. Now we've looked at a little bit of the background of what goes into paper piecing and seen how that foundation paper piecing has become such a critical piece of creating a Legit Kit quilt. Let's look now at some of the tools that are going to help us to be successful as we go through this. So I'm just going to review some of the things that I use, and as we use them, I'll point them out specifically in that process, but I want to tell you what they are so that you can see what we have. So as with other types of quilting, I use cutting tools. And in this, I have 2 or 3 different types of rotary cutters that I like to use. Some people promote using a different rotary cutter with an older blade for cutting paper and a newer blade for cutting your fabric. I use the same blade for each one. I may use a different size for different purposes, but I use basically the same blade and a newer blade in everything I do. And one of the reasons I do that is in the foundation paper piecing, you're going to, at some points, cut both paper and fabric in some of your trimming. So you're going to end up with the paper and the fabric both being cut anyway. I just go ahead and simplify my life by being able to use just one. This is a pair of scissors that, for those of us who have some arthritis in our hands, makes it a little bit easier to open and close. These are not a high-end quality pair of scissors like you'll find in some brands, but they are very utility useful scissors, and they help with when I'm using something a little bigger. I don't have to put my fingers inside those little holes like this, and that makes my arthritis a little bit better. You probably have a better quality pair of scissors, and that's good, and you're welcome to use those. I would rather use these just for my hands, and they work well for me to be able to do that. I also reach over here and get a pair of snips. I use that as I cut my thread at my sewing machine. And when I trim the little dog ears off of my pieces, I oftentimes use this little pair of Kai scissors. They're very sharp and really nice, and I like the curved edge to be able to get right up against the block without any problem. When I'm sewing and I come across those big lumps that sometimes happen when lots of seams come together in your paper piecing, I like to have a stiletto handy. The stiletto allows me to help guide that fabric through there. The other time it's very helpful is when I'm sewing two segments or two blocks together. I have paper facing out so that the feed dog is trying to grab paper instead of fabric. When that happens, sometimes it doesn't grab it as securely as it would if it were fabric. And so the stiletto allows me to help guide that through without it drifting and jerking around, and I can keep my line a little bit straighter. I don't know about you, but people say sometimes you can do foundation paper piecing if you can sew a straight line. Well, I'm here to tell you, I can't sew a straight line most of the time, and I can still do foundation paper piecing, and we'll talk about how you can too. So let's move these out of the way. We'll talk about a few other tools that are not specific to cutting or getting that through the machine. So one of the things that is very important are measuring and rulers. With foundation paper piecing, you don't have to do a lot of measuring. The rulers will do it for you. The pattern pieces will do it for you. So here is an add a quarter ruler, and it is 12 inches long. And some of our pieces will be a little bit longer in the Legit Kit process because of the fact that our blocks are roughly just a little smaller than a regular sheet of paper. And then here's one that's only 6 inches long. And so they do the same thing. They have a ridge on the back. It fits right up against that fold, and then you can trim so that you leave a 1/4 of an inch, and we'll show how to do that as we do the cutting and sewing. But I use these because this one is closer to the size of most of the segments, and on occasion when I get a longer line I can use this one. If you choose to only get one or the other, this one will work for the smaller segments as well. It'll just be a little more length on it, and this one will work for the longer segments. You'll simply start, and then as you need to progress you'll scoot it down before you cut the last bits. So those work just fine. Now when we go to trim after we've put an entire segment together, then I like to have a ruler. These happen to be creative grids. They're 1 inch by 12 inches and 1 inch by 6 inches, but they have that texture on the bottom. I use creative grids and Quilter Select rulers primarily because they have good grip on the bottom. And then when I do this, I can have something that has a good 1/4 inch marking on it, and it has a good straight line that I can put down to grip, and I don't have a bunch of extra with a big fat ruler sticking off to the side. Now if I had a 6 inch or a 8 inch ruler, could I use that to trim this? Absolutely. I just find these smaller ones to be a little handier in the workspace that I'm using. Now we'll scoot these out of the way, and I want to show you a couple of other trimming tools and folding tools that I use. So these are, you can actually get these from Legit Kit. So this is a folding ruler, and what we do with this is, and I will demonstrate to you when we go through the process of sewing the first month, we will actually lay this edge, this ruler's edge, on the straight line on the paper piece and be able to fold it over so we can get a nice crisp line to line everything up behind it when we line the fabric up behind it, or if we're looking to do it in some of the cutting we may use it. But this is to lay there. It's very thin but thick enough to be sturdy so that we can lay it on the paper and get a nice crisp folded edge. Another trimming tool that we can get through Legit Kit is this, and I'm going to turn it sideways so more of it fits in the camera. But this is the size your block will be when you complete it. So, and it shows the 1/4 inch seam allowance here. So if we get finished and we need to just kind of lay this down and trim to make sure everything is nice and square when we're finished, we're able to lay this on top of our block after we've put all the segments together and trim around it to make sure that we have a good square block that's ready to go into our quilt. I use pins. Now, some people don't like to use pins, and that's okay. But these are the pins I use, and I love my little hedgehog or porcupine, I'm not sure what they are, pin cushions. They're nice and fuzzy and make me happy when I play with them. But these pins are a little bit thicker shaft. And I use these pins when, after I've cut fabric, I pin it to the location it goes on the paper that it's going to be sewn to, so I can keep it where it goes. These pins are considered ultra fine, and I use them to sew over. Some people don't like to sew over pins, and that's okay. If you're one of those folks, there are other ways to do it. I find it helps me to keep the points aligned with the points that they're matching up to if I sew over the pin. So there'll be some places where there aren't points lining up that I may use a clip. And these clips I use sometimes in that seam line when I'm not having to line up points. I also use them, depending on how thick they've gotten, to kind of keep the segments that go in a particular block together. So I'll use clips to secure things as well. And then I have this one stray pin that's a little bit different. It's got a very long shank and it's nice and straight. I haven't sewn over it and gotten it bent. And so I use that to line up the points before I pin them together when I'm going to sew segments together. And we'll demonstrate that as we go through. But those are the types of pins that I use and the clips that I also supplement with in order to keep things together so they don't drift as I'm working with them. I also glue pieces together as I go through. So I use a couple of different kinds of glue. This is Scotch repositionable glue. So it's made essentially to make your paper act as if it were a Post-it note, where you can put it down, pull it off, put it back. Anytime I'm gluing paper to fabric, which happens with the first piece in every segment, then I use this glue because the other glue is washable and it's fabric glue, but it's just harder for me to pick that piece of paper off that fabric when I'm pulling my papers out because once it's dried, it nearly needs to be wet to come off. This will simply pull right off of there, and so I like to use it when I'm doing paper to fabric. The other glue that I use, I like these sew line pins. You can use an Elmer's glue, any washable, fabric safe glue you can use. But I like the sew line glue pins. You can tell mine's nicely used here. But you put a refill in it and they just scroll up like this. They keep a fairly small point. So that allows me, when I have this smaller point like this, to be able to keep this in the seam line better and not get it out onto the main part of the quilt. Now, if it gets on the main part of the quilt, is that a disaster? No, it's washable. We can take just something wet and wash that off just a little bit and it'll dry and it'll be just fine. But I prefer not to have to stop and take that step if I have something narrow enough to keep it in there. It comes in refills, and the refills come in different colors. They have pink, blue, and yellow. And this happens to be a yellow one that I had sitting over here that I can use as a refill. And you simply pop this off and put that down in the little hole there. It pops into it and it will just scroll right down in there and you'll have your refill in there. So they're simple to refill. I like to use all three colors, not for any special reason other than they're pretty. And I just like some variety in life. And so I will use all three colors on it. When I'm sewing on the machine, one of the things that I do is I use this Wonderfeel Deco Bob 80 weight thread. And the reason I do that is the seams get pretty thick sometimes when you have several coming together in paper piecing. The paper allows us to get all those coming together nicely. But when they get thick, everything I can do to sort of take that thickness and keep it from getting too bulky is helpful. The higher the number on the weight of thread, the thinner the thread. So an 80 weight thread is much thinner than the standard 40 or 50 weight that you may typically sew with. And that's the reason I use this. I use it in both the bobbin and I use it as my top thread. I normally use a neutral color that I think is not going to show through if a seam line falls within an area that might show through a lighter color fabric on the quilt. And so this is what I use, and it helps me as I go through to keep that a little bit thinner. When I'm sewing, I also like to use two different feet. So some of you may have a sewing machine that has a shank that comes up on the foot. Mine has my sewing machine happens to have a shank where this pops on and off of it. So yours may look a little bit different, but these are the two types of feet that I like to use. I like to use this open toe foot when I'm trying to see the line, and it's much easier for me to see it when it has an open toe. It's maybe a little hard for you to see. I'll hold it up here, but there's a little marker right there. That also tells me if my needle is aligned properly, and if it's not, we need to take it to the repairman and get him to align it. But if my needle is aligned properly, then it is going to hit right there. So I can take that little mark and I can let it guide onto the line to try and keep my seams a little bit straighter. When I'm putting the segments together and I'm really sewing a 1/4 inch seam, I do sew on the line on the paper, but if I use this 1/4 inch foot, it makes it easier for me to have sort of a secondary point that's telling me that I'm on track and in the right place. And if for some reason I'm sewing on an area that the paper has come loose from, then I still have the 1/4 inch guide to be able to help me. Now, you may have a 1/4 inch foot that has a little metal piece down here that you can push the fabric against and it will hold it. I have one of those too, but I do not use that when I've got paper going on because I don't want it to accidentally get onto a portion somehow where that paper is going to be under that lip and it's going to drag across the paper. It just makes it a little bit more difficult for me to send it through. So these are the two that I use. I use the 1/4 inch foot that does not have the metal flange on the side, and I use an open toe foot. And those help me as I go through the process. Now, on occasion, I don't know about you, but on occasion, I make a mistake. And I have to use a seam ripper to take it out. Now, some people have those electric seam rippers that look like a hair trimmer, and they can be very useful. I tend to just use my standard seam ripper when I do it. And I will show you during this process how I remove a seam. If for some miracle I don't make the mistake during what we're doing, I'll get one that I know I have over here I've made a mistake on, and we'll take it out and we'll show you exactly how that works. The other thing I use when I make mistakes is washi tape. So when I have a piece that I had to take the seam out, sometimes that paper, because I used a small stitch length on my sewing so that I could tear the paper easily, sometimes that paper just begins to come apart. And I need it to stay where it was so that I can re-sew that line. Well, once the seam is out and that's loosened, I can raise that paper up and put a piece of washi tape on the back side of the paper to hold it back in place. And when I do that, then I can still see the line on the top to be able to sew and redo that seam. And the washi tape, when I go to press that, is not susceptible to melting. Now, there are some Scotch tapes or some transparent tapes that will not melt too bad, and there are some that will melt really bad. So rather than you have to worry about which one you got, I just use the washi tape instead, and I find it very useful for that purpose. I also use some things when I am pressing. So when in the same vein as when I use the very thin thread in order to keep my seams as flat as possible and as thin as possible, I also use this Acorn Easy Press pin, and there are refills to what's in it. What's in it is simply a starch. The beauty of this is when you are going to take something to your iron and put it under there so that you can press that seam open, if you take this tip that the starch bleeds into, you can be very precise with taking that right across that seam line so that you can press the seam line as crisp as possible without having to starch the whole thing. And so this allows me to have a nice crisp seam without having to starch all of my fabric. I enjoy using this as well as this refill that goes with it. It is, Acorn is the brand name. It's an easy press pin, and then it's simply the refill for it. The other thing I use, and you saw this when we went through our packet and I had been working on some of the things, this is a heat erase pen. So I can write on a piece of paper and then use this pen and erase it. So let's say that you finish your Starry Night, but you still have the pattern and you'd like to buy from Legit Kit an extra packet of fabrics to make a second one. They'll let you purchase the fabric without the pattern because you already have it. But you went through and checked all that stuff off as you did it to know that you did that. Well, you can go and erase it, or you can mark it off, or you can use a second type of marking to do this. But another instructor showed me this, and I think it's a wonderful idea, and I've begun doing it, is you can simply write with a heat erase pen on that paper, and when you're ready to redo that, you simply take a hot iron and apply it to the paper, and that ink goes away. And now you're ready as if you had a brand new pattern that had never been written on to use it again. So that is a wonderful way if you want to make a second one, to just simply order the fabric kit for it from the company and then be able to take those lines off and those marks off of your papers, your guides, and you can then use them again and have them as clean and open and not be confused about what's already been done and what you're about to do. I also use this to organize my fabric. This is, I get this from Amazon. It's Blue Summit Supplies Expanding A to Z Desk File, and it's the letter size. And you can see that it's simply a binder that is set up so that you can open it up and you can see these tabs through the alphabet. And so I can pick up tab A and I can put my fabric in there. And you can see where I've been working on blocks A1 and A2. I had these two fabrics under A and I was able to organize them in this folder. And when I need to find them, I very easily flip this over and do that. Now I leave those scraps in there after because I may use them later on in a different part of another block. And they may be helpful if I have a miscut to be able to go back and know I have some extra in there. So until I've completed the entire quilt, I leave these in here. And each month you'll get new fabric and you can add those in here with it. But I keep them in alphabetical order arranged in here. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get organized. Now the final couple of things that I use is I do have, as you see, everything setting down here on this Caterpillar light table. I find this is helpful if you have a light box or a light table that you can use in order to line some things up. So it lets you see through the papers to tell for sure that the fabric is far enough out from the line and covering the area that you want to be covered by the paper. And it lights up. You can lay it on here, and that's beautiful. With the Caterpillar cutting mats, they come with, or light tables, they come with a cutting mat that's clear so that you can see through it. This one has lines. Some of them have, some sizes have a clear one that has no lines, and you may prefer that. But I use this in order to line things up easier. Now, do you have to go buy a light table if you don't have one in order to do this quilt? No. Now, if I were going to do lots of Legit kits or lots of paper piecing, I would probably go buy one. But if you're going to just do this one to test it out and you're not sure if you need it, I'll show you how, as we go through the process, you can simply lift up the corners and the edges in order to be able to tell that it's lined up. It's an extra step, it's a little more cumbersome, but it certainly works just as well as using the light table, and so we'll be able to do that without a problem. Then I'm going to rotate my camera here just a moment and show you that next to my cutting space, I have set up just a side table that is a pressing mat. And on that pressing mat, I have a travel iron. Mine happens to be Oliso. I think it's really cute because when I press that button and I turn it on to green, my little headlight comes on. So just like my glue, where I like it where it's entertaining and it has different colors, I like my little iron that has a headlight on it. So that's fun for me. So once I have all these things together, I have all the tools I need in order to make my legit kit. And I will be ready to go through and do this. Now, I've got my email down here if you have any questions about any of this or want to find out more information or provide some comments. I would certainly be glad to hear from you on that. Please let me know. And this will be here, and I went through this in a little more detail this time so that you can refer back to it if you have questions on foundation paper piecing in general, or if you have questions on the tools that we'll be using and what those are and how we use them. In month one, we'll go through and we'll take a look at the actual cutting and piecing. But if you want to look back at information on the tools and stuff, you can go back to this video anytime you want and be able to get the information needed to answer those questions or see what you need. So I'll be back to see you again as soon as we get ready to begin our cutting and sewing. And we'll work on month one of Starry Night.